Cool. So my name's Stephen Horns, and welcome to my talk on hacking humans, social engineering techniques, and how to protect against them. So the agenda for this afternoon is to first look at what social engineering is. Then we're going to go through and look at some famous social engineering cases that you may or may not have heard of in the past. Then we're going to get to the interesting stuff and look at some actual social engineering techniques. Then we're going to look at how to protect against them, both from a personal standpoint and from your company's standpoint. And then I'm going to give you some resources for further research, because it is an interesting subject, and we can't possibly cover all of it in 1 hour, so I'm going to give you some interesting resources to look at. So generally, social engineering leads to illegal activity. So a little disclaimer at the beginning. So I'm not condoning that. This talk is about mitigation and prevention. And people that generally do social engineering are doing it for illegal activities, and they normally end up here. So that's my little disclaimer out of the way, in case any of you try and blame me if you're him. So this is a huge subject. We have an hour, so we've got a lot to get through. But I mean, you could literally spend your entire lifetime studying this stuff. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a framework that we're going to look at, and then you can take it further to study if you want to. But first, let's start with a little story. So it was a wet and blustery night, and Keith was sitting in tech support in his company doing the graveyard shift. He's sitting there very bored, waiting for his lunch break where he dreams of playing his game of pool. Then suddenly the telephone rings. He picks up the phone, and it's Tim from Accounts. He's the Vice President of Investment Funds and Investments, something very important in the company. So Keith's like, hello, this is Keith from Tech Support. How can I help you? And Tim goes, Keith, I really need your help. I'm locked out of my system. I cannot access my files. We have investors coming in tomorrow for a Series B investment. This is worth £150 million. If we don't close this deal, the company's gone. And I can't get my files, and I can't prepare for it. Can you help? I've tried doing a password reset via the website, and it keeps crashing. So Keith sits there and ponders what to do. Standard processes, you are supposed to go through an online portal to change your password. But this guy is really high up. He's heard the guy's name before, so he believes he's real. And he goes, okay, sure, I can help you out. I can do a forced password reset on my end, and then you can go and change it on your end when you first log in. So he does, and Tim tries to log in, and then he changes his password, and it works. So Tim is incredibly grateful. Keith, you've just saved this company. We're going to have the investors come in, we're going to get this investment, and it's all down to you helping me out. Thank you very much. And he hangs up. So for the rest of Keith's shift, he's walking on air. He's just helped a large executive in the company solve a problem. He's having visions of himself running down the hallway, high-fiving everyone to the Rocky theme tune. That's how much of a good day he is. Meanwhile, Tim, or Dave, the hacker, is currently logging onto the system using an account that he's taken over and changed the password, and is currently copying off hundreds of documents, which he's going to sell to someone who's paid him to steal those documents. So that's our little story, just to set a bit of context. So what is social engineering? A classic definition of social engineering is it is about influencing someone to take an action that may not be in their best interest. So I'm going to try and get someone in here to do something against your best interest. So there's three kind of typical broad areas of social engineering attacks that you'll be familiar with. So the first one is phishing. That's where you get an email that's pretending to be, say, NatWest Bank. You click on a link to try and enter your details, but really someone's just recording your password. Or your typical Nigerian print scammers. They're all similar sorts of things. Another one is called vishing. So vishing is similar to phishing, but it's done over the telephone. So has anyone received those phone calls from the Indian call centre claiming to be Microsoft? Yeah, so I've received quite a few of them, so has my parents. So that's phishing. So they're trying to get you to either give up credentials or pay for a service which you don't actually need. And the other classic one is impersonation. So this one doesn't really involve any computers as such. It's about someone impersonating someone else to try and get you to do something against your own will. So let's look at some statistics. I'm guessing most of us are developers in this room, so we like stats and numbers. So these stats were taken from a website called socialengineering.org. It's a fantastic resource. URL's down there if you can read that. I'll make the slides available afterwards on my blog. So for phishing, 90% of all email is spam, and phishing represents about 77% of all social-based attacks. So that's a huge proportion of the email and the types of attacks that are basically social attacks through phishing. And these generally involve you trying to click on a link to do something like, taking over your bank account details. So with phishing, scams over the telephone. So in 2012, these are fairly old stats, but they kind of illustrate a point. So 2.4 million customers were targeted for phone fraud in 2012. But just in the first half of 2013, 2.3 million customers were targeted for phone fraud. So you can see that the curve in which the problem is arising is getting a lot bigger. And someone very clever somewhere has calculated that the average loss for a targeted business is around $42,500 per compromised person or account. So for impersonation, a few details here. So medical ID theft is on the rise due to websites impersonating medical providers, which are 1.8 million victims in 2013. And the top place for ID theft is actually the workplace. So if you imagine your desk at work and the amount of information you probably have lying around, which may seem completely innocent and innocuous, is actually very valuable to someone. And 80% of thefts involve disabling or bypassing controls. And 88% of reported stolen assets were personal data. So details about people, names, addresses, phone numbers, dates of birth, anything about a person is very valuable on the black market, especially if that data comes with medical information. I think you can sell those details for about £400 or £500 per person.
What region is this?
Pardon?
Is it just the UK or is this Europe?
These ones are probably US-based. It's a US-based site. So types of social engineers, they come in all sorts of shapes and forms. So probably none of these are going to be a surprise to you. So your typical hackers. Penetration testers, they're probably the only ones on here who are actually sort of genuinely going to try and do some of these techniques. So pen testers are there to try and, or they're paid to break into your systems legitimately to try and stress test them. Spies, your typical James Bond style spy novel type stuff. It's probably not as glamorous as that, but it sort of stuff does happen. Identity thieves, disgruntled employees, that's quite a big one. So someone who's actively disenchanted with their workplace is likely to be someone who will steal information from the workplace. Recruiters, they're a classic one. They're always trying to get you to do things against your will. Is there any recruiters in the room? Good. Governments and salespeople, so classic sales techniques. They're trying to get you to buy something, even if it's something you don't really want or need. But can anyone guess who one of the best types of social engineers are? There's one that I've left off. Children. So any parents in the room? Whose kids can wrap you around their little finger? Mine do it every day. And they're very good at manipulating you. So why do people do social engineering? Well, it consistently works. People are very fallible. And we'll look at some of the reasons why sort of later on in the talk, but it consistently works. So if it didn't work, then they wouldn't do it. But it does work. And for any network, the people in the organisation, like computer network, the people are the biggest vulnerability. So you can spend hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds on infrastructure, intrusion detection devices, firewalls, all that good stuff. But if you have some people that aren't following basic rules in your organisation and give out credentials or leave passwords lying around, then all that money spent is for nothing. And generally, social engineering is a path of least resistance. So if you imagine someone's got a password file and they want to try and brute force crack that password file, that's quite a lot of effort they have to go through to do that. And it could be quick or it could take a long time. Or with a little bit of manipulation and social engineering, they can get someone to reveal their password. So typical common types of attacks, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's just to give you a flavour. So customer service lines, where attackers get the numbers or email addresses from websites. They'll phone up the companies and they'll try and do random password resets just by giving out surnames. There's a rather large, well-known bookstore online which has had this happen to them before. I won't say the names because we're filming it, but you can use your imagination. And generally, when people try and do an attack via a customer service phone line, the people on the other end of the phone who work for the organisation, if they've got a lack of training, generally they have a desire to please. They want to try and help the person on the other end of the line, so they're more likely to be susceptible to someone trying to get information out of them. So delivery staff, this is another big one. So people turning up at your organisation pretending to be a delivery man. They don't even have to be very convincing. You just need a brown boiler suit type uniform and a rather ropey fake looking badge and ID, and you can quite easily get access into a building just with a big parcel under your arm. So another common attack is just general phone calls. So this could be either to a company or just to an individual person at home. If you've got someone over the phone, it can be very easy to manipulate them. And tech support is another one, as we saw in the example in the story at the beginning. And generally, when you phone technical support, it's normally to try and get access into a system. So before we look at some techniques around social engineering, let's just look at a few sort of classic cases of social engineering. So the first one is a guy called Kevin Mitnick. Has anyone heard of him before? Yeah, he's quite a famous one, especially with IT people. So he had quite a high-profile arrest in 1995, where he spent 5 years in prison. So he's paid his dues back to society. But he first started off when he was a kid by stealing records out of bins for the LA bus service. And he used that to try and form a scam, which helped him ride the buses for free. And his first computer hack was when he was age 16, in 1979. It was against the DEC Computer Company, and he basically formulated a scam which enabled him to get copies of software for free. So whilst he was a fugitive, so on the run from the FBI, he just consistently kept on trying to break into computer systems. It was as if it was a game. So in the end, he was charged with 14 counts of fraud and 8 cases of unauthorised access. But today, though, he's a reformed character. So he's written several books. These books are excellent if you've not read them. The one on the right there, Ghost in the Wires, is more of a biography. It's a great read. But he also runs a very successful security consulting company where he now actually teaches governments and large organisations how to protect themselves from people like him. So he's made quite a good career out of it. But he has paid the price, ultimately, by going to prison for a long time. So this is another guy called Frank Abagnale. Has anyone heard of him before? So he was born in 1948, and he's what is referred to as a confidence trickster. But he also did a lot of cheque forgery, and he was a very good imposter. And over his career as a criminal, he took on eight different identities, including an airline pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer. And he was very convincing in doing this. And even when they did catch him, he managed to escape custody twice. So he's quite a slippery character. So most of you have probably heard of him from this film here, Catch Me If You Can, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. So it's a very good film. It kind of Hollywoodifies his experiences. It's a little bit more glamorous than probably what it actually was, but it's a very good film. And there's another shot from the film. So that's when he was pretending to be an airline pilot. So the final one I want to quickly look at is a guy called Charles Ponzi. So he's very famous. You've probably heard of the Ponzi scheme or the pyramid scheme. And what this involved is it was mail fraud using international reply coupons. So the way it would work is you would send money to agents in another country who would buy international reply coupons, send them back to the US, and he would then exchange them for stamps. But he could then go and sell the stamps for higher than what the reply coupons were paid for, so he makes a profit. So he made quite a lot of money out of doing this, but being a criminal and being quite greedy, he wanted to make more. So he started recruiting people where he would use them as investors to invest money into this scheme, and then he would pay them back with the profits. And obviously that keeps on going down in a big pyramid. This is all working quite well until a newspaper, the Boston Post, started getting suspicious when they looked at his tax returns. And as soon as his investors got wind of this, they all started withdrawing their money out of the scheme. The entire thing collapsed. And it was at that point he was arrested. So he was charged with 86 counts of wire fraud and owed an estimated $7 million at the time. So quite a lot. Well, it's a lot of money now, but it's a huge amount of money back then. So he pleaded guilty, and he spent 14 years in prison. And my clicker stopped working. Oh, there we go. So we've looked at what social engineering is at a very high level. It's the art of getting someone to do something that's not in their best interests. And we've taken a look at some sort of classic examples, sort of 3 classic examples that have been in the press. So what I want to do now is just to cover some very basic techniques. So what we're going to look at is information gathering, pretexting, elicitation, and manipulation. So they're kind of like the 4 pillars of social engineering. Or the 4 pillars that I can fit into an hour anyway. So the arrow is kind of going a line. These kind of things happen in an order. So the first one is information gathering. So to do an effective social engineering attack against your victim, you need to put in a lot of preparation. You can't just walk up to someone and start pretending to be someone else and hope for it to succeed, because it most likely won't. So what you need to do is you need to do research on your target, whether that's a person or a company or a set of people, because a successful attack or a successful end goal might actually require you to con more than one person to get to where you want to go. It's not necessarily just going to be you con one person, then you get to your goal. So one very popular way of doing information gathering is to do what's called dumpster diving. Very American term, but basically it means going through people's rubbish. And it's a mucky job, but you'd be surprised what you can find when you do that. So quick show of hands, who shreds all their paperwork and documents before they throw them in the bin at home? Cool, that's good. And that's very important because a lot of people don't. I mean, everyone in this room, I guess, is quite sort of tech savvy, but people who aren't in our sort of line of work or industry probably aren't as astute as you guys. So you'd be surprised what people throw away. So bank statements, credit card statements, old prescriptions maybe, medicine bottles. So if you're on a particular type of medication, when you're finished with it, you just throw the packaging away. Well, that's very useful information because people know what drugs you're being prescribed. If your bin is full of wine bottles and beer bottles, someone can actually tell that you actually quite like a drink, and then they can use that information later because, you know, probably a good place to try and con you is by talking to you in the pub. But even food packets, you know, just very simple things like, you know, what you eat, what you drink, the sort of information you throw away, you can actually build up a massive picture, and all that's in your rubbish bins in your back garden. So the other area is called open source intelligence, or OSINT as it's called, and basically that's just a posh word for saying looking at what's available online and gathering information about that person. So Facebook, if you haven't got your profile locked down properly, which a lot of people don't, can reveal quite a lot of information. Photos, things you've been up to, films that you've seen. You'd be surprised how much personal information people entrust into these social networks. Again, Twitter, lots of information posted by people can give you quite a good background as to what that person's about. Hobbies, interests, what football teams they like, what music they like, the sort of people they hang around with, you know, sexual persuasions. It can tell you all of that sort of stuff. Another one, which is probably the most serious one in my mind, is LinkedIn. Because you think about the amount of information you put on LinkedIn, so it's all your past employment history, probably lots of information about projects that you've worked on, probably information about projects you're working on now, qualifications, all that sort of stuff. And then the other ones are basically search engines. So I'll put Google on there, but then I thought I might as well put Bing on there as well in case there's any staunch Microsoft people in the room. But Google, Bing, all those sorts of search engines, you can just Google for people and find information on them. So another form of information gathering is by malware, or getting malware installed on your machine. So this can come from various sources. So we talked about phishing, where you're clicking on links in very convincing looking emails. Well, one thing they could be doing is they could be installing keyloggers onto your system. Or another form that's becoming quite popular is screenshotting tools, which frequently take screenshots of stuff on your screen, zip them up or compress them, and then sort of send them back via a VPN tunnel somewhere, like a drop server somewhere. Another very common way of getting malware onto people's machine is by having a delivery man, as we talked about before, walking into a building, then he just strategically drops rather appealing looking USB thumb drives on the floor. So if you pick up a 256 gig thumb drive on the floor, you're probably going to be quite impressed. Ooh, 256 gig, they're quite expensive. Go put it into your machine and it can auto-execute code and install malware onto your machine. So never plug in thumb drives that you pick up off the floor. Another very easy way of gathering intelligence on people is shoulder surfing, literally just looking over someone's shoulder. So last week when I was commuting home, so I work in Nottingham, I live out in the countryside in Derbyshire, I was commuting home on the train. I was sitting next to a lady who had her laptop open, and I could quite clearly look over her shoulder and see she was writing up a disciplinary warning for a member of her staff. I didn't even have to glance at her screen for that long to find out what her email was about. So that's how easy it is. You always need to be aware of what it is you're typing on your machine at any one point. So if I'm doing, because I'm a manager in the company I work at, if I'm writing personnel notes on people, I generally try and do it away from the team so people can't look over my shoulder and see what I'm writing, because it's private information. There are some good mitigations for shoulder surfing. Apparently it's a real product, it's called a privacy scarf, and I really want one. Okay, so we've looked at information gathering. So you need to build up a lot of information about the person that you're going to mount an attack on. That's probably one of the most important areas of social engineering. You need to go in prepared, knowing who it is you're targeting, what companies you're targeting, who they are and what they're like. And then with all that information in hand, you go on to the next stage, which is called pretexting. And this is the practice of presenting oneself as someone else in order to obtain private information, otherwise known as acting, or taking on a persona. So some some principles that are used in pretexting. So planning and research leads to more success. So we've said the point quite a few times. You need to put your effort into doing research up front. Shared interests make success more likely. So if the person you're trying to attack is a Derby County fan and you're a Derby County fan, then you've got some shared information which you can talk confidently about. If you know someone's into a particular band, I don't know, 9 Inch Nails for example, because I quite like them. If you like the same sort of bands as them, you're going to be able to talk more confidently about them. Because when you go and do a pretexting attack or take on a persona and talk to someone, you're not going to go straight in and try and get information from them. You're going to try and build up a rapport with them. And that might take, weeks, months, years even, depending on what it is you're trying to do. So good acting definitely helps. I'd probably be rubbish at it. I was useless at drama at school. But yeah, good acting definitely helps. You've got to be convincing to the person you're talking to. And keep it simple. Don't try and overcomplicate the pretext that you're doing. So, try and keep elaborate backstories to a minimum. And just be more aware of what it is you're trying to get out of the person. Also, try and use information that needs no verifications. The last thing you want to do is the person to try and question what it is you're saying to them when you're talking to them. So if you talk about, I don't know, you give up a particular football statistic or talk about a particular game and you've got that information wrong and then they then come back and try and verify that information or question that information, that can help, or well, not help, but it can actually make it difficult to build up trust with someone. So planning your pretext, so you need to define what your aim is. What is it you're trying to achieve ultimately from this person? As I say, a social engineering attack may not just be centred against one person. You might have to do pretexting or take on multiple personas with different people to get what you want. So you need to plan for different reactions that stray from the happy path. So if all goes well, you've got a list of questions, you've got a plan of how you're going to talk to this person over, I don't know, a matter of weeks. And if all goes well, you get the information that you want. That's great. Chances are that's probably not going to happen, and things are going to stray off your plan. So how are you going to deal with that? You need to have a plan in advance of how you're going to tackle a different line of questioning. If you accidentally say something that offends that person, how are you going to backtrack from that? And, talking about keeping it simple, will just being friendly be sufficient? If you're meeting someone deliberately in a bar to try and get information out of them, you don't necessarily need to put too much effort in up front. You can just go in and be friendly with them. So there's another definition of social engineering here which I quite like. So the clever manipulation of the natural human tendency to trust. And the key word there is trust. So building up trust with someone takes time. So if you meet new people, like at a conference, for example, you probably meet lots of new people. Are you necessarily going to have that element of trust with them straight away? You'll probably respect them, you'll probably like them, but trust is something that takes time to build. And it's definitely not instant. Okay, so the next technique is called elicitation. And this is the act of getting information without directly asking for it. So generally, when we're talking to people, most people want to be polite. It's a general human tendency. We want to be nice to each other. And people also want to appear well informed, so you can use that to your advantage. So nobody wants to be that person where they're asked a question, like on stage at a conference, and you can't answer the question because you don't know the information. Nobody really likes being in that situation. People want to appear well informed. So if you're questioning someone and talking to them, it might actually be quite easy to get some information out of them because they don't want to look stupid, so they'll be willing to give information up. And people also want to be appreciated. So who likes it when you do a good bit of work in your job and then your boss actually turns around quietly to you and says, thanks for that, that was a good piece of work. Has anyone ever had that happen to them? The rest of you need to try harder. But it's a general human tendency. We want to feel appreciated. We want people to think or know that we've done a good job. And most people don't like to withhold information or lie. People, as you said, people want to be honest. So doing effective elicitation requires that you understand how to communicate with people. Now, that's a very easy thing to write on a slide on a presentation, but actually in practice, it's something that that's probably studied over a long time. It's all, human psychology, which is why I'm saying this is a huge subject which you could literally spend your entire life studying and practicing. But having a good understanding of how people communicate, how to build up trust with people, how to make people feel appreciated is actually very important to doing elicitation. Because if we go back to the definition of elicitation, you want people to give you information without you directly asking for it. So you don't want to go up to someone and say, I want your password, because they're not going to give it to you. You want them to reveal information voluntarily. So you have to adapt your communication styles to fit that particular situation. So not every situation, not every person is the same. Some people are more naturally guarded. So if you're trying to get information out of a software developer, the chances are, although not all the time, they're going to be more introverted than, say, someone who works in a call centre, for example. So you need to adapt your communication style. And you also want to build up a bond with your target. So, as I said before, you don't just want to go straight in for the kill, as it were. Well, not the kill, that's a bit harsh. But you want to build up a bond, you want to build up trust, and that takes time. So, a lot of the time this is done down the pub. Get people drunk, buy them drinks, then people start loosening up, and then you build up that bond with them. And something that's very important is staying within the character of your pretext. So, a very good example of this, I haven't done this by the way, but a very good example, a husband who's cheating on his wife. He might go and meet his lady friend, and generally he takes his wedding ring off. That's all part of his pretext. He's trying to come across as someone who's single. And then there's that one time where he accidentally turns up and he's forgotten to take his ring off. As well as being incredibly awkward for him, he's broken his pretext, because that's not the persona that he was trying to portray. And when you're doing elicitation, you want to use effective questioning techniques. So we'll spend a bit of time looking at some questioning techniques now. So there's 4 main techniques that we'll look at. So there's neutral questioning, open, closed, and leading. And many people heard of these before when you do those sort of icky courses that you have to do with your employers. Yeah, communication skills and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, we're going to go through that. So a neutral question does not directly target, does not direct the target on how to answer. So you're not trying to lead them in any particular way. It's a very passive style of questioning. So for example, how do you like the weather today? It's not directing them in any way. It's very neutral. How do you like the weather today? One person might say, I think it's quite, well, yesterday for example, I think it's quite sunny. Whereas Troy Hunt was going, bloody hell, it's cold, I want to go back to Australia. So very different types of answers, because you're not being directed. Then we have open-ended questions, which encourages full, meaningful answers about the subject's own knowledge and feelings. So, for example, tell me about the relationship with your father is a very sort of open question. Or how do you feel about the election candidates? That probably would have got some quite colourful responses last November. On the flip side to open questions, we have closed questions. And closed questions give us control of a conversation and allowed us to lead it where we want it to go. So, for example, building on the questions we said previously, so do you get on with your father? Well, that's a very binary answer. It's kind of yes or no. Who are you going to vote for? Trump or Clinton? So those are very good. Well, they can be good if you're trying to narrow someone down, but if you're trying to get someone to be very open and expressive with you, then closed questions are quite bad to use. And the final one is a leading question. So this is where you're subtly prompting someone to respond in a way that you want them to, or in a direction that you want them to. And it's very useful as a manipulation technique. So generally, leading questions aren't that good, but if you're trying to manipulate someone, this is kind of your bread and butter. So if we look at the example here, so do you have any problems with your boss? So directing that person there with the word problems and boss is kind of implanting in someone's mind that they may have a problem with their boss. They may not do, but then they might start talking about issues they do have with their boss. Or how fast was the red car going when it smashed into the blue car? So that question is it's planting into your minds that the red car was going very fast and it smashed into the blue car, so it must be the red car's fault. Not necessarily. The red car could have been going very fast and the blue car swerved across a lane and smashed into the car. But it kind of leads you down a particular way of thinking. So when you're using these techniques, you want to use them as a kind of a funnel. So you start off with very neutral questions, which you can then start narrowing down with open and then closed questions. And then when you're trying to get to getting a final answer out of someone, you can use a directed question, which generally is used as a last resort. You'd hopefully got the information you need by that point. So just to recap then, so we've talked about pretexting and elicitation, and so the differences between the two is pretexting is taking on a persona, and elicitation is using that persona to extract information. So the two go hand in hand. Okay, so the next part we want to look at then is manipulation, and there's a key difference between manipulation and influencing someone. So influencing is a way of getting someone to change their mind in a way that is good for them. Whereas manipulation, you're trying to change someone's mind in a way that is not good for them. So ultimately, influencing is a win-win situation. It's a win for you and a win for them. And when you're manipulating someone, it's a win for you and a lose for them. So manipulation generally is bad. You don't want to manipulate people. It's quite horrible. But for a social engineer, this is absolutely what you want to do. So this is the definition of social engineering we looked at the beginning of the talk. So the act of influencing someone to take an action that may not be in their best interest. So really what we're saying is it's the act of manipulation. Because it may not be in their best interest, so it's a win-lose situation. So if we look at some classic manipulation techniques, so one is called the fear then relief technique. Think back to the example in the story at the beginning, where the guy on the phone was using fear as a tactic. So, you know, I'm an executive VP in the company. If you don't help me, we're not going to get this investment, and then you'll have no job. So he was using fear to try and shock someone into doing something for him. So here's another example. So, hi, this is tech support. We detected a virus on your machine, and it could lock all your files. So that's the fear part. All of the files on your machine could be damaged. We need to install a virus killer, so we can help you out. So that's the relief. So by that point, the person's just like, I want to get the virus killer on my machine, I want my files rescued, because I'll probably not back them up. So at that point, I said, well, can you please tell me your password? I'll log onto the system, install the virus killer, and then your system will be fine. So, I mean, that's a very simple, trivialized example, but it's an example of using the fear relief technique to then get someone to give up their password. So another technique is using guilt, and using guilt as a way of getting someone to comply. So this might be where you do someone a favour as part of your pretext. Over an amount of time, you do lots of favours for people, you try and help them out, but you then try and use that as a way, or you try and use it against them later. So if the person you're pretexting against, you find out that they're having an affair, that's valuable. You can use that against them. If they're an alcoholic, for example, and their family don't know, but you've managed to find out that information, you can use that against them. So effectively, it's using a secret as blackmail. Now, an example, I need you to copy these files for me. You owe me a favour. I kept X as a secret for you. So I've done something for you. Please do this thing for me. Another technique is called the foot in the door technique. Classic technique used by salesmen as well. So asking a victim to do a very small request first, and once they comply, follow on with a real larger request. So a typical example as well could be, when you see beggars in the streets, or panhandlers, I think they call them in America, where they stop you and ask you the time. You tell them the time, and then they ask you for change. That's a classic example of the foot in the door technique. Salesmen use it as well, so door-to-door salesmen. They'll try and strike up a conversation with you first. They'll ask you, what do you think of the weather today? Or they'll ask you a series of questions. And I can't remember the name of the study, but it's something where they said if they can get you to say yes twice to something, then you're more likely to stand there and talk to them and follow through with a transaction, or at least listen to them. Okay, so we've looked at some high-level techniques on social engineering. So it's information gathering. You need to plan what your attack is, who you're coordinating an attack against, gathering information. We've looked at pretexting, which is taking on a persona, using that information that you've gathered to try and build up trust with someone. And then we've looked at elicitation, which is the act of using that pretext to get information out of someone without directly asking for that information. And then we've looked at some of the techniques, manipulation techniques, that are commonly used. So what can you do? What can you do to protect yourself and your companies against this sort of thing? And luckily, it's actually quite simple, a lot of the things you can do. So we'll split it into two areas. So we've got personal mitigation and we've got corporate mitigation. So common targets in an organisation tend to be people like junior staff, so people that have not been with the company very long. They're there, they're very eager to please, they want to climb up the corporate ladder, so they'll do whatever they can to try and please people and to succeed. There's nothing wrong with that. Having ambition and wanting to help people and succeed is a good thing, but manipulators will use that to their advantage. Contractors as well in an organisation aren't necessarily as heavily invested in that organisation, might be more willing to give up details about stuff. I've worked with various different contracting organisations from around the world who have all been very willing to please and have given me lots of information when I've asked for it, especially in the last company I worked at, when they probably shouldn't have. Admin staff as well, non-technical people, receptionists, people that do the photocopying, sort of general admin staff in a business. They're not going to be as sort of savvy to these sorts of things, will be very willing to help out and give up information. And support staff, where we've looked at people calling into call centres to get information. So if you ever have someone phone you up in a business trying to ask you a question which you might be a bit suspect about, then always ask for identification. So back in the story at the beginning, Keith, the technical support guy, should have really tried to verify who was on the phone with him a bit better. The guy just phoned up, said his name. You'd never met him in person, but he recognised the name, but he didn't do anything to try and verify who he was. Watching for out-of-character questions. So, for example, if a delivery man is delivering parcels to your organisation and then he wants to get access to different parts of the building, he asks if he can drop something off in the server room, for example. That's kind of out of character. You wouldn't expect that. And also, if someone is trying to deliver something or they phone you up and they start giving a very elaborate backstory as well, which is out of character because you wouldn't expect them to give so much of a backstory, it can be seen as a trigger. So another very simple thing that you can do is just not let guests roam around in a building by themselves. So if you have visitors come to the company, escort them to a reception area, get them to sit down, make sure someone keeps an eye on them. If they do need to go somewhere in the building to meet someone, take them there, just escort them. And we've discussed this one already, but if you find a USB device on the floor, don't plug it in. Take it to your IT support, get it destroyed, throw it in the bin. Even if it's tempting to plug it in because it's a quarter of a terabyte drive or whatnot, just don't plug them in. And this one as well is just being aware of what it is you're saying. So if you're talking to people in an organisation, say on a different product, or you're talking to someone down the pub or in a social context, whenever you're talking about work, just always be aware, should I be saying this? Is it relevant for me to give up this information? If you start talking about the project you're working on at work, is it something that's supposed to be quite secret? Is it something that gives you competitive advantage? Should I really be discussing this? Again, they're very simple things to mitigate it, but they're things that will actually have a big impact. So this one as well, shred documents, both at home and in the office. So the company I work for, we have series of shredders around the office. We have one by the printer, by the main bin, and one in two of the offices. And, you know, it's our policy at work that anything that goes in the bin, we shred it. Going back to USB drives, you don't go storing confidential details on the drives, then just stick it in your pocket, especially if it's not encrypted, because USB drives are very easy to lose. I lose several of them each year due to being clumsy and having kids that like stealing stuff off my key rings. So anything I do store on USB drives, I make sure they're encrypted. So things like the SanDisk drives, which have AES encryption on them, are good things to use. Also, if you own a laptop, computer laptop, make sure you install drive encryption on there. So when I'm using a Mac, one of the first questions it asks you when you set it up is, do you want to enable encryption? Always make sure you hit yes. So if your laptop gets stolen or you lose it somewhere, then people can't access information off of your laptop. Because you'd be surprised, you know, how much of a treasure trove your work laptop is. You've got source code on there, you've got documents on there. It's very valuable. Therefore, people might try and steal it. So being aware of who's looking over your shoulder. So as I said before, I gave the example where I was commuting home just last week and just glancing over the woman sitting next to me on her laptop, not deliberately trying to read what was on her screen, but you can't help it because you're naturally nosy. I could read what she was writing in an email. So always be aware of who's around you. So if you are working on the train, are you working on something that's really appropriate? You know, are you displaying confidential information which someone could just look over the seat and see what you're typing? So another thing is educating yourself. So, you know, coming to talks like this, courses on Pluralsight, books. It's good to make sure you get educated. And this goes for companies as well. They should be educating their staff on what to look out for. So with information like we've discussed today. So next one is sort of more corporate mitigation techniques. So is anyone in the room in a position where they can sort of define policies in the workplace? One person? Okay. This is kind of aimed at you, but for everyone else, if your company doesn't do these things, then it's kind of good to mention them and try and get them to adopt them. So one thing that's very important is identifying what information assets are most valuable. So this is like documents that you might have stored in SharePoint or whatever document repository that you have. And use simple information coding so that it's very apparent to anyone who works in your organisation what that document is. So you can mark it as green, OK for release. So that could be sales information, brochureware, documents, stuff that's OK to go outside the company. Then the next one is amber, read only with authorization. Release only with authorization. So it's documents that might get sent out to other people or other companies, but you need an authorization of someone higher up in the company. It could be multiple people, especially if it's a large company with a complicated structure. But these documents require someone to sign off that you're sending them out. Then the next one is confidential, do not release. So these are documents that should never go outside the company. But if they're clearly marked on the document, then it makes it easy for you to know whether it should be sent out or not. So it's just a very simple information coding exercise. So another one is having the corporate security policy documents. Who's had one of these thrust at them and told to read it? Hands up, you read it. Oh, okay. Cool. So these documents can typically be very big. But they are important, and that covers things like encryption policies for your source code, AV and antivirus policies for what should be installed on a machine. If a company lets you bring your own device, and what the company expects of you from bringing your own device, what they're going to install on your machine to monitor it. They're quite dry, boring documents, but they are needed, and legally they're very good to have. But as a company, just giving them out to people and saying read it and then putting a big tick in a box, it generally doesn't work, although quite a lot of you are quite good at reading them, so that's good. But what you should really do, or what the company should do, is actually put some training in place. So if you've got 100-page worth of policy documents, then put in small training courses together on what's in those documents is generally the best way to try and do it. So computer-based training. If you are looking to put any of these policies in place, there's a good website here at sans.org that actually has a series of templates which you can use, which means 90% of what's there in those templates you can just use, and then you just tailor it to what you want for your organisation. So the company I work at, a very small startup in Nottingham, we're actually using this, and we're using this to build our own security policies. This one as well, sort of more for the IT guys, is make sure you keep software updated and patched religiously. So there's lots of different exploits that are detected, even in things that seem very innocent, like Microsoft Word. These exploits give career criminals and professional hackers a way of getting into systems. And people like Microsoft, you know, they know this and they patch their software frequently, so always keep your software and your operating systems updated. But you'd be surprised how many companies don't. Going back to the idea of shredding documents, again, it's very simple, but if you're in a very large company, then it's quite common to have a professional document destruction service in place. So these are companies that put the big security bins everywhere. You put the documents in, then they'll come on site with a big van and shred everything in the back of the van. So I've worked for several companies that have those. They're not that expensive, and they're a good way of making sure confidential information doesn't get out of the organisation. So you should never assume that your company is too small to be a target. So if there's something of value inside your company, like commercial value, commercial secrets, or a way of getting into data to do a data breach to steal personal information, if there's something of value there, then people will try and find a way to exploit it. And as we've seen, the way they do it through the pretexting and elicitation, you might not even know that someone's doing it. You might have befriended someone and be friends with them for 6 months before you even realise that there's something wrong. So, in quick summary then, for what we've discussed, how are we doing for time? Cool. So, social engineering is the act of influencing someone to do something that may not be in their best interest. So, it's a win-lose situation. We've covered different types of social engineers, and they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, including children, who are very good at manipulating parents. And people do social engineering because it consistently works. It's very easy to do for people that have been practicing it. And that's because people are the biggest vulnerability in any network, and it's a path of least resistance. So trying to get information out of someone is a lot easier than trying to hack a computer system. So 4 main pillars that we looked at: information gathering, pretexting, elicitation, and manipulation. There are lots of other areas in there, and I'll point you to some good resources in a moment if you want to research this any further, but the 4 main pillars are those areas. And then we looked at some mitigation techniques for yourself as individuals and for companies. Okay, so some cool resources which I think you should look at. So the 3 books I mentioned earlier by Kevin Mitnick are fascinating. They're quite easy reads as well. Each of them's about the size of a novel. So I read them all on holiday once, much to my wife's dismay, while she was sitting there reading her Dan Brown novel. But Ghost in the Wires is particularly interesting because it's more of a biography. So it's about how Kevin got into doing what he was doing and some of the techniques he used. So it's really interesting. This book here is kind of the Bible of social engineering. The website, which I took those stats from earlier, is the sister website for this book. It is a big book. It's about that thick. It's not an easy read, but it is really informative, and there's lots of examples. It goes into lots of different nuances of psychology as well. This book as well, I recommend. So, because of the amount of time we've got, we didn't really have time to talk about body language, because you could probably spend an entire hour just on that subject alone. But this book's really good. So this guy, Joe Navarro, is an ex-FBI interrogator, and he talks about lots of different techniques that the FBI uses to tell if you're lying. So some examples: if you're questioning someone in a work capacity, disciplinary, for example, if they start moving their feet or legs towards the door, pointing them that way, it means they're uncomfortable and probably lying. So that's some of the techniques he talks about. People overly rubbing their hands on their legs is a sign of nervousness. But if someone's sitting there with their hands like that, that's called steepling, which is a sign of confidence. So he just talks about lots of these different techniques. It's quite fascinating. He talks about one case where there was a guy being convicted. Well, they're trying to convict a guy for murder, but they were having trouble pinning it on him. And in the end, they got this guy in because he's a bit of an expert at reading people. And from watching back hours of videos and looking at the little micro expressions in this guy's eyes, they managed to work out that he was guilty and eventually convicted him. So that's one of the stories that's in that book. So that's largely what I wanted to talk about today. Bit of information about me. So I work for a company called Buying Butler and Writing Dem. It's kind of two companies in one. So I'm the head of development there. And part of my role is actually defining the information security policy and making sure that our developers and staff aren't going to fall prey to social engineering attacks, because we hold quite a lot of insurance data. So obviously we don't want people to accidentally give any of that information up. I'm also an author for Pluralsight. I've done about 8 courses now. We recorded a new one yesterday in the HoloLens room, which is quite cool. So I've got lots of courses on there. I will be doing a social engineering course over the next couple of months. And also spend quite a lot of time going to conferences, because my company that I work for is great and they just let me go, which is brilliant. So I can be seen talking around the world, NDC Oslo, hopefully can do Sydney this year, and Techorama and SDD in London in May. And also run a user group in Derby called derbyshire.net. So if anyone's ever in Derby on the last Thursday of the month, you're more than welcome to come along to our user group. It's free. And we have beer, free beer. It's great. So I hope this talk's been interesting. I hope it hasn't left you all paranoid that the next person you talk to in the lunch queue is going to try and manipulate you and get information out of you. People generally are nice, especially at conferences like this. So, but you know, you might want to wear your tinfoil hat. And thank you. So, is there any questions from anyone? Yeah.
You need to give them an extra bit of ID. How would you implement a safer way to do it without causing problems to the user? Because if it was a genuine case, they go, I'm locked out of my computer, I don't know any information, you're really not helping me. How does you implement a good security policy in that way to prevent social engineering, but it still allows your staff to do their required?
Yeah, I don't know, that's a tricky one, because in that situation, because ultimately the tech support guys reset the guy's password. So even though he was having a really good day that day, so at some point in the week, someone's going to start pointing fingers at him because he unlocked the account which was used to steal those documents. Which doesn't really answer your question, I know. But I mean, phoning back, yeah, that's a good one. Phoning them back.
We had a recruiter that threatened to go to the police if we didn't give a name of one of our very good IT people. Of course, we just asked if she could give her the phone number and phone her back, and she didn't.
Okay, that sounds a bit dodgy. I mean, actually, when I used to work for, I remember the internet bank Egg. A lot of you are probably doing PPI claims of them right now. But back then, we actually had someone who routinely kept on calling up and asking technical information about servers that we had on our estate. And that's kind of how I first got introduced to this idea, because we got warned, because Egg was quite good at protecting against this sort of stuff. And we got warned that someone was phoning around asking different questions about different parts of the estate. And we worked out all the different questions they were asking. Actually, if everyone gave those bits of information up, actually gave them quite a good outline of our IT infrastructure. We never did find out who it was, but it was something that was warned against at the time.
I work for an online games company, and our players love to scam each other out of their stuff, or indeed try and get them to give passwords. So rather than, as well as just educating them, saying, for goodness sake, don't type your password in the chat box, how could we build systems that make it harder for people to scam other people out of their, amazing magical sword or whatever?
Good question. I don't know, I mean, that's a massive thing. It all depends on what it is you're building and designing, I guess. So the things that they're trying to scam out of in the game, do they have financial value at all? Is it where people have paid for coins or?
There are sites that you trade in-game cash for.
Right. So if you're trading cash for assets in the game, I don't know, I imagine there's some kind of financial compliance you have to deal with as well. Because
we don't do that. It's against our terms.
Okay.
You go to ChineseGolfFarming.com and people for $3 will sell you 10 million in in-game cash.
Right.
So in-game cash does have a value effectively.
It's like currency trading. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure how to answer that. That's a without knowing more about your entire company. But maybe we should meet in the bar and you can tell me all about it. Cool. Well, thank you. I'll be hanging around the conference for the rest of the week. So if you just grab us.